Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here with me. Our goal today is to give you more background on the Korean War, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that were in last night's readings, but in more depth, and preview some of the main things coming up in the Korean War and why they are so significant. So here we go. At the start of the Cold War, the United States did not understand what was happening in Asia as well as it understood what was happening in Europe. So this is right at the end of World War II. One thing we've already talked about is the Chinese Civil War. The communists were clearly winning more support, as we know, and the U.S. realized that they were doing a better job than Chiang Kai-shek, but nonetheless, they did not realize how extremely popular they had become. And they were pretty shocked when the communists won. Okay, so that took them aback. So in 1949, the State Department created what's called a white paper. And a white paper report is basically takes a complex issue and writes a report to get at the key things that are involved there to help people understand it. And so they wrote this white paper report on China. And it was essentially correct. It reached the same conclusions that we reached in class. Mao was better at connecting with the population. Chiang Kai-shek was corrupt. The economy was bad. Mao had all these assets, and therefore he won. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Second thing that the U.S. did not understand well was the very nature of communism and the relationship between Mao and Stalin. The U.S. believed that the Soviet Union and China were acting in concert all the time as soon as the communists had won, and even that Mao was working with Stalin before that. Now, we know that Mao admired Stalin a ton, but he was intent on finding his own way that was right for China, right? He had his own Maoist thought and his peasant vision and was competing with the 28 Bolsheviks. The U.S. was pretty oblivious to that and just assumed that because China had won, that they would do whatever Stalin said and that the two of them would coordinate. This was a huge misperception, and as over time, as the Soviet Union and China grew apart and began to compete with each other, the U.S. remained really oblivious to that. The third thing was about the Korean War. The U.S. for years, like until the last couple decades, assumed that the Korean War was essentially Stalin's fault and that Stalin encouraged it and wanted the war and encouraged Kim Il-sung to pursue the war. We now know, because of documents that came out after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that that is not true. And you'll be reading a lot more in depth about that tonight. But this was Kim Il-sung's war from the beginning. And he was the one that had to get Stalin to agree to let him do it. And you'll see how China fits into that too. So I said that I would talk a little bit more about this white paper on China in 1949. As I said, the white paper basically came to terms with what had happened. And this is just a State Department document. But it shows that internally they were able to wrap their heads around what had happened. But that was written in 1949. And in 1950, Joseph McCarthy came on the scene and began the witch hunts of the Red Scare. The incredible amount of press and fear that were generated by McCarthy changed everything. Truman, who was president at the time, Truman was president until 1952 election, and his Secretary of State was Dean Acheson, had to change their public messaging. Initially, they were saying pretty much what the white paper had said, that it was probably inevitable, but they very quickly had to change their messaging on this and say that this was a terrible catastrophe and that the U.S. had to be much stronger. As a result of this, the State Department fired almost all of their China experts. Now, they had some pretty talented China experts prior to this. They had a lot of people fluent in Chinese. They had people on the ground. They had contacts, spies, and many of their experts really understood what was happening in China pretty well. After they fired them, they didn't have any of that. And that meant that the U.S. was at a huge disadvantage in trying to understand what was happening in China for almost 20 years, really, until a new generation replaced those that had been put in on purely ideological anti-communist basis with little understanding of China. The next thing I want to talk about is NSC 68. So NSC, again, stands for National Security Council. And if you haven't done last night's reading yet, it'll be really important that you do that. But the purpose of NSC 68 was to have an internal document assessing and then outlining the best approach to the Cold War in the new circumstances. The recommendations that came out were all based on three assumptions made by the NSC when they put this together. First of all, they assumed what I'm going to call the monolithic view of communism, which is the idea that Stalin and Mao, or the Soviet Union and China, were one, and that they were united, and that they were choreographing their moves and planning together. We know that's not true, as I said, but at the time they believed that. The second assumption was that this threat was going to stick around for a long time, that it was a very serious threat, and that they had to be ready for a prolonged danger. And the third thing that it assumed was that the US had to meet the challenge of communism everywhere in the world. So this basic assumption then immediately spread the Cold War from just a European conflict, which it had really been up until 1949, to a worldwide conflict, or at least to where they were going to, they thought the US should take action everywhere in the world. So the recommendations are explained in the reading, but I tried to boil them down here for you in this slide. Number one, it said that the US should never negotiate with the Soviet Union, that they were not trustworthy allies, that they were not trustworthy partners, and we should not try to, not just because they weren't trustworthy, but they weren't safe, and therefore we should not try to compromise with them. Secondly, we needed to develop hydrogen bombs. So here you see the beginning of the escalation of the nuclear arms race. So the first type of atomic bomb that was dropped on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the first generation of atomic bomb. Hydrogen bombs are a whole new level and much, much more powerful. So they're, you could call this like the second generation of nuclear weapons. Thirdly, it called for a rapid buildup of conventional forces. Conventional means non-nuclear. And the idea was that they didn't want the United States to have to be dependent on using nuclear weapons in any war, even though they had done it in Japan, but they ought to be able to win most wars with regular weapons, so that we wouldn't have nuclear war destroying the world. But that meant that there had to be a huge investment in building up regular weapons, because ever since the end of World War II in 1945, they had been cutting back. And now remember, this report came out in 1950. So they called for huge tax increases to pay for increased defense spending. And they said in order to be able to pass these tax increases, that we would have to work very hard to build public unity around this idea that the Cold War was an essential for the United States' safety, and that everyone would have to be willing to sacrifice and be united for this. So this recommendation then led to a huge wave of propaganda from the US government, and certainly fed into the McCarthy scare. Next, it called for a strong alliance system that the US would lead. By now, NATO had already been created, but this encouraged the US to build more investment in NATO and to expand to include other security systems, alliance systems in other parts of the world. So shortly as we turn to Asia, you're going to see the creation of SEATO, SEATO, which is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, that the US and Japan and Asian countries joined to try and be a bulwark against communism in the Pacific. Finally, the last recommendation called for undermining the Soviet Union from within. Essentially, this means spying. And we'll see that not under Truman so much, but starting under Eisenhower, this was fully, completely embraced. The CIA got created, and we see the sort of the dawn of the spying era of the Cold War. So NSC 68 was enormously important for a number of reasons. It was not immediately adopted. And in fact, Truman was not sure that he was happy to adopt all of it. It was still under discussion. One of the main sticking points is that it was going to be extremely expensive, and the public was not up for more tax increases. So, why was this significant? For one thing, it meant the end of containment as we studied it when we did the rise of the Cold War. Now, containment's going to come back, but for the time being, it meant that containment would not be enough anymore if we adopted this. This visual right here is to remind you what containment is. It's the idea of stopping the spread of communism to any new places. In other words, drawing the line. It can't go past this, okay? And shifting instead to a stronger stand, which is rollback. What is rollback? Rollback can be defined as, and here's a visual for you on that, as actually pushing communism back from places where it has already started. So trying to literally fight wars or defeat communism in countries where it exists. Okay, the second reason it's significant is, like I said before, it fuels the Red Scare. It made the importance of U.S. image and prestige incredibly important to U.S. politicians, and it became the basis for U.S. policy following the Korean War. So all those recommendations were implemented, not immediately, but by the end of the Korean War they were. When we apply this shift from containment to rollback to Korea and the Korean War, as you study the course of the Korean War, you're going to be able to watch this shift in policy play out. So when we first entered the Korean War, the U.S. entered the war with United Nations forces. So it was not just the U.S., it was technically a UN force, but U.S. General Douglas MacArthur was the head of those forces. And the U.S. had the largest number of forces by quite a bit. When the U.S. entered the war, our goal was containment. In other words, to help South Korea defend itself, don't let it spread. In the middle of the war, we switched to rollback. We, instead of just defending South Korea, we invaded North Korea and tried to defeat communism in North Korea, where it already existed. And there was a serious debate about whether to continue on and even carry the war into China, which would be, a further extension of rollback. The final ending of the war, which came through stalemate back at the 38th parallel, which is the line between North and South Korea even to today, meant that the U.S. had achieved containment, the original goal, but had not succeeded at rollback. And this became a public relations problem for the Truman administration. They tried to present this as a victory because they had achieved their original goal, but because the troops had gone so far into North Korea and the public had gotten excited about driving communism out of Korea altogether, there was a whole segment of the population that saw this as a loss, which was very damaging to Truman and the Democratic Party. Okay, so the next concept I want to talk about is the idea of limited war. Okay, so the next concept I want to talk about is the idea of limited war. A limited war is the opposite of total war, which World War II was, and we talked about during World War II. So in a limited war, countries do not use everything they possibly can in order to win the war. They might not have a draft. They might, although we did in the Korean War, they limit the weapons they can use. So in other words, not using nuclear weapons in the Korean War was one way it was a limited war. They don't fully mobilize all their industry and resources, and so on. When the Korean War started, Truman was very specific in saying that this would be a limited war. He would not get into another gigantic war. So he refused to invade China when push came to shove. And he was very clear at the beginning of the war that they would not go into other Asian countries from Korea, that this was just about Korea. They kept U.S. troops limited by working with the UN to get more support and bring in other troops. They would only offer limited logistical support, certain types of weapons, airplanes, and so on. He even referred to the war, and the US government referred to it as a police action to keep the concept of war out of it. And in general, he shielded the public from the worst parts of the war rather than promoting it. Now, not everyone in the US was in favor of keeping the Korean War a limited war. Some of the groups that opposed it were Republicans, and the more conservative they were, or at least in terms of foreign policy, the more hawkish they were, the more they supported the idea of total war. Joseph McCarthy, the senator, used this to batter Truman and the Democrats repeatedly and to call them soft on communism. This was a charge that McCarthy was often leveling at the Democrats and the Truman administration. And this was part of his main evidence, is they weren't doing enough to defeat North Korea. Another person who opposed it was General MacArthur, who was leading the troops. And this became a major problem when a showdown arose between MacArthur and Truman. So why did it matter that this was a limited war? In terms of setting the tone for the Cold War, not just the tone, but the practice of the Cold War, it became immensely significant. After the Korean War, every war that was fought during the Cold War, but involving the US or Soviet Union, was either a proxy war, where they were both fighting through other people, or even if one or the other side entered it directly, they kept it a limited war. There was never use of nuclear weapons, and they never went all in. And really, this reflects the impact that the invention of nuclear weapons had on both war and diplomacy. Total victory was no longer the only goal. It was also saving the earth, saving humanity. Even though they were continuing to rapidly build and escalate more and more terrible nuclear weapons, that was more. Nonetheless, they felt that they did not want to use them unless there was really no choice. And in many ways, those became a deterrent from further action. Okay, finally, the issue of limited war was significant because it eventually led to the firing of Douglas MacArthur. So this is one of the, I think, really interesting stories of the Korean War from the U.S. point of view. As the U.S., there came a point in the war where the UN troops were approaching the border with China, and they were moving north, and the Chinese had already warned the US that they must not get too close to the border, and they certainly could not cross into China, obviously, but they didn't even want them close. They had initially warned them not to even enter North Korea. So as there was debate going on within the administration about how far to continue towards the Yalu River and so on, MacArthur, who is the head of the forces, was arguing really strongly for invading North Korea, which he did, but then for continuing right on into China. And in fact, he demanded that the US use nuclear weapons and just get rid of those commies in China once and for all. And, that's sort of how MacArthur would speak. So Truman was adamant that that was not going to happen. And what MacArthur did is he went public with his demands because there was a fair amount of public support for that at the time. And so he actually published his own thinking in newspapers around the country in an open letter calling for the US government to do this. Well, that's a gigantic breach of the chain of command. A general doesn't get to publicly challenge the decision of the president. And so Truman fired him. Now, in terms of maintaining the chain of command and discipline and everything else, firing him was absolutely the right thing to do. But it was, again, damaging to Truman in maintaining public support at a time that the United States was incredibly anti-communist. MacArthur was a hero in the United States, a huge hero. He was the hero of World War II. He had been the person in the Pacific that had led the US troops in the Pacific and defeated Japan. He had led the battle back into the Philippines. And so when he was fired, he returned home from Korea to a giant military parade, ticker tape parade, literally like hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets screaming and yelling and supporting him. And as you can imagine, Truman was extremely unpopular with all those people that were supporting MacArthur. So it did have a political cost for Truman. So as you can see from the last couple of slides and discussions, by 1950, the ideological approaches in the United States to communism had shifted further to the right than they were, a lot further to the right than they were in 1945 at the end of the Cold War. The liberal point of view here was pro-internationalism. In other words, like Truman working together, I'm not saying pro-communism at all, but Truman working together with the United Nations in Korea is a perfect example of internationalism. Work with our allies, work with partners to manage conflict in the Cold War. The moderate point of view, which had been the rightist position back in 1945, 6, 7, was now the middle point of view, which was containment, stop communism from spreading. And now the right side and the more hawkish side was calling for rollback. Let's go to war and get rid of communism where it exists. Now, when I lay out those three positions, students always ask me, but wasn't there a far left side? The answer is barely. In the United States, in the public sphere. Were there people that believed in socialism and communism? Yes. But at this time, during the Red Scare in the United States, they were largely silenced. And they were a very small group. So a little bit more on this, the domestic considerations, because as we get into the Cold War, after we're done specifically with the Korean War, one of the themes is going to be that a great deal of the action that took place in the Cold War actually was responsive to what was happening inside the countries, domestically, for the US and China and the Soviet Union. So we're already seeing how this was happening to Truman. As McCarthyism and the Red Scare were picking up steam, Truman had to be more aggressive in Korea. So he agreed what was supposed to initially just be containment. He agreed to invade North Korea and try to drive Kim out, even though they ultimately failed at that. And that helped him gain the support of Republicans. The second big domestic consideration for Truman was his budget. He really did believe in and want to expand the conventional nuclear capabilities of the US to some degree, and he did not have the votes in Congress to do it. Actually, he was closer to the votes in Congress than he was from the public. The public did not want increased taxes. So this made him more willing to fight a more aggressive war going into North Korea to generate more public support, and thus he was willing to risk making China angry because it generated a lot of domestic support for his defense budget, which he thought would keep the US safer. Now, how did Truman interact with McCarthy? That's an obvious question based on all these things. Truman did not like McCarthy. He was not what we call a red baiter. In other words, he was not trying to get to accuse just everyday folks of being anti-communist. He was definitely strongly anti-communist himself. He just was not into accusing innocent people of being communists. Some examples of the fact that he now represented a more liberal position on this: he vetoed the McCarran Internal Security Bill, which was a bill that required communists to register with the government. Pretty clear violation of some of our constitutional protections. So Congress passed that bill and he violated it. And there is literally a quote from him in 1951 that the greatest asset that the Kremlin has is Senator McCarthy. He believed McCarthy was feeding into the craziness. But because of this, because he took stands like this, he was attacked by Republicans and fairly vulnerable to the accusations of being soft on communism. And the result was there was more public support for MacArthur, and Eisenhower easily won election in the 1952 presidential elections, which starting in 1953 is going to lead to a new direction in the Cold War. But that's previewing what's coming up. All right, finally, the end of the Korean War, looking ahead, a couple of things you should know. The end of the Korean War did have some major effects on US policy. One, as I said, it caused the NSC 68's recommendations that we were looking at the beginning to be put into place almost across the board. And the defense budget was tripled, which was extremely expensive. US land forces in Europe were greatly strengthened so that the US felt that they would definitely be able to deter attacks, without resorting to nuclear weapons. NATO was expanded. Remember one of the recommendations to expand security interests. CETO was created, and they began working to bring Western Germany into NATO. So those were a few of the short-term effects. And as you work through Korean War this week, by Friday, you'll be learning a lot more about effects of the Korean War. So thanks for sticking with me so long, listening to me, and I hope you have a great rest of the day today. Bye-bye.